that this is week 8. We're talking about chapter 12. It's kind of a strange chapter. I'm not real crazy about it, but let's go ahead and get through it anyway. Okay. Single subject research. Single subject research is a type of quantitative research that involves studying the behavior of each of a small number of participants in detail. Single subject does not mean that only one participant is studied. It is more typical for there to be somewhere between 2 and 10 participants. This is why single subject research designs are sometimes called small n designs, where n is the statistical symbol for the sample size. Single subject research can be contrasted with group research, which typically involves studying large numbers of participants and examining their behavior primarily in terms of group means, standard deviations, and so on. Single subject research is an important alternative to group research, and it is the primary approach in some areas of psychology. It is important to distinguish single subject research from two other approaches, both of which involve studying a small number of participants in detail. One is qualitative research, which focuses on understanding people's subjective experience by collecting relatively unstructured data, for example, detailed interviews, and analyzing those data using narrative rather than quantitative techniques. Single subject research focuses on understanding objective behavior from experimental manipulation and control, collecting highly structured data, and analyzing those data quantitatively. It is also important to distinguish single subject research from case studies. A case study is a detailed description of an individual, which can include both qualitative and quantitative analyses. The history of psychology is filled with influential cases studies, such as Sigmund Freud's description of Anna O, which he actually didn't. He wasn't a counselor in that case. It was his partner Brewer that did the counseling. She had hysteria, what they referred to as hysteria. She would go blind at certain moments. She would become paralyzed at certain moments, and they talked her out of her problems. She later became quite a famous feminist, and this is her picture. This is a picture of her in her feminist garb. That was in the 1880s and 1890s. Single subject research involves studying a small number of participants and focusing intensively on the behavior of each one. But why take this approach instead of a group approach? It is important to focus intensively on the behavior of individual participants. One reason for this is that group research can hide individual differences and generate results that do not represent the behavior of any individual. For example, a treatment that has a positive effect for half the people exposed to it, but a negative effect for the other half, would on average appear to have no effect at all. Single subject research, however, would likely reveal these individual differences. A second assumption of single subject research is that it is important to discover causal relationships through the manipulation of an independent variable, the careful measurement of a dependent variable, and the control of extraneous variables. For this reason, single subject research is considered a type of experimental research with good internal validity. It is important to study strong and consistent effects that have biological or social importance. Applied researchers are interested in treatments that have substantial effects on the important behaviors and that can be implemented reliably in the real world contexts in which they occur. This is sometimes referred to as social validity. The extent to which a single subject study focuses on an intervention that has substantial effect on an important behavior and can be implemented reliably in the real world context by teachers in a classroom, for example, in which the behavior occurs. And of course, this is a child behaving badly. Single subject research has been around as long as the field of psychology itself. In the late 1800s, one of psychology's founders, Wilhelm Wundt, studied sensation and consciousness by focusing intensively on each of the small number of research participants. Hermann Ebbinghaus's research on memory and Ivan Pavlov's research on classical conditioning are other early examples, both of which are still described in almost every introductory psychology textbook. Features that are common in single subject research, the dependent variable is measured repeatedly over time at regular intervals. The study is divided into distinct phases as the participant is tested under one condition per phase. The conditions are often designated by capital letters A, B, and C, and so on. Another important aspect of single subject research is that the change from one condition to the next does not usually occur after a fixed amount of time or number of observations. Instead, it depends on the participant's behavior. The researcher waits until the participant's behavior in one condition becomes fairly consistent with an observation to observation, from observation to observation before changing conditions. From observation to observation. There you go. Allowing behavior to become fairly consistent from one observation to the next before changing conditions is sometimes referred to as the steady state strategy in single subject research. This makes any effect of the treatment easier to detect. The idea is that when the dependent variable has reached a steady state, then any change across conditions will be relatively easy to detect. Recall that we encountered the same principle when discussing experimental research more generally. The effect of an independent variable is easier to detect when the noise in the data is minimized. And this is noise right here. We have consistency, and then all of a sudden we have a breakdown. The most basic single subject research design is a reversal design, also called the ABA design. During the first phase, A baseline is established for the dependent variable. This is the level of responding before any treatment is introduced, and therefore the baseline phase is a kind of control condition. When steady state responding is reached, phase B begins as the researcher introduces the treatment. There may be a period of adjustment to the treatment during which the behavior of interest becomes more variable and begins to increase or decrease. Again, the researcher waits until the dependent variable reaches a steady state so that it is clear whether and how much it has changed. Finally, the researcher removes the treatment and again waits until the dependent variable reaches a steady state. This basic reversal design can also be extended with the reintroduction of the treatment, ABAB, another return to baseline, ABABA, and so on. There are close relatives of the basic reversal design that allow for the evaluation of more than one treatment. In a multiple treatment reversal design, a baseline phase is followed by separate phases in which different treatments are introduced. The researcher might establish a baseline of studying A, then introduce a treatment, B, and then switch to a different treatment, C. The participant could then be returned to a baseline phase before reintroducing each treatment, perhaps in the reverse order as a way of controlling for carryover effect. This particular multiple treatment reversal design could also be referred to as the ABC-ACB design. There are two potential problems with the reversal design, both of which have to do with the removal of the treatment. One is that if a treatment is working, it may be unethical to remove it. The second problem is that the dependent variable may not return to baseline when the treatment is removed. One solution to the baseline return problem is to use a multiple baseline design. In one version of the design, a baseline is established for each of several participants, and the treatment is then introduced for each one. Each participant is tested in an A-B design. The key to this design is that the treatment is introduced at a different time for each participant. The idea is that if the dependent variable changes when the treatment is introduced for one participant, it might be a coincidence. If the dependent variable changes when the treatment is introduced for multiple participants, especially when the treatment is introduced at different times for the different participants, then it is extremely unlikely to be a coincidence. In another version of the baseline design, multiple baselines are established for the same participant but for different dependent variables. The treatment is introduced at a different time for each dependent variable. Baselines for both tasks could be established. The logic is the same as before. If productivity increases on one task after the treatment is introduced, it is unclear whether the treatment caused the increase. But if the productivity increases on both tasks after the treatment is introduced, especially when the treatment is introduced at two different times, then it seems much clearer that the treatment was responsible. Single subject research differs from group research in the way that the data are typically analyzed. Group research involves combining data across participants. Group data are described using statistics such as means, standard deviations, Pearson's R, and so on to detect the general pattern. Inferential statistics are used to help decide whether the result for the sample is likely to generalize to the population. Single subject research, by contrast, relies heavily on a very different approach called visual inspection. This means plotting individual participants' data, looking carefully at those data, and making judgments about whether to and to what extent the independent variable had an effect on the dependent variable. Inferential statistics are typically not used. In visual inspecting their data, single subject researchers take several factors into account. One of them is changes in the level of dependent variable from condition to condition. If the dependent variable is much higher or much lower in one condition than another, this suggests that the treatment had an effect. A second factor is trend, which refers to gradual increases or decreases in the dependent variable across observations. If the dependent variable begins increasing or decreasing with a change in conditions, then again this suggests that the treatment had an effect. It can be especially telling when a trend changes directions. A third factor is latency, which is the time it takes for the dependent variable to begin changing after a change in conditions. In general, if a change in the dependent variable begins shortly after a change in conditions, this suggests that the treatment was responsible. Some advocates of group research worry that visual inspection is inadequate for deciding whether and to what extent a treatment has affected a dependent variable. One specific concern is that visual inspection is not sensitive enough to detect weak effects. A second is that visual inspection can be unreliable, with different researchers reaching different conclusions about the same set of data. A third is that the results of visual inspection and overall judgment of whether or not a treatment was effective cannot be clearly and effectively summarized or compared across studies, unlike the measures of relationship strength typically used in group research. Single subject researchers argue that their use of the steady state strategy combined with their focus on strong and consistent effects minimizes most concerns. If the effect of a treatment is difficult to detect by visual inspection because the effect is weak or the data are noisy, then single subject researchers look for ways to increase the strength of the effect or reduce the noise in the data by controlling extraneous variables, for example, by administering the treatment more consistently. If the effect is still difficult to detect, then they are likely to consider it neither strong enough nor consistent enough to be of further interest. Many single subject researchers also point out that statistical analysis is becoming increasingly common and that many of them are using it as a supplement to visual inspection, especially for the purpose of comparing results across studies. Some advocates of single subject research worry about the way that group researchers analyze their data. They point out that focusing on group means can be highly misleading. In a traditional between subjects experiment, the positive effect on half the participants in the treatment condition would be statistically canceled out by the negative effect on the other half. A mean for the treatment, the mean for the treatment group would then be the same as the mean for the control group, making it seem as though the treatment had no effect when in fact it had a strong effect on every single participant. The second issue about which single subject group researchers sometimes disagree has to do with the external validity, the ability to generalize the results of a study beyond the people and situation actually studied. Advocates of group research point out the difficulty in knowing whether results for just a few participants are likely to generalize to others in the population. Single subject researchers note that the strong and consistent effects they are typically interested in, even when observed in small samples, are likely to generalize to others in the population. Single subject researchers also note that they place a strong emphasis on replicating their research results. When they observe an effect with a small sample of participants, they typically try to replicate it with another small sample, perhaps with a slightly different type of participant or under slightly different conditions. Each time they observe similar results, they rightfully become more confident in the generality of those results. Single subject researchers can also point to the fact that the principles of classical and operant conditioning, most of which were discovered using single subject approach, have been successfully generalized across an incredibly wide range of species and situations. As with quantitative and qualitative research, it is probably best to conceptualize single subject research and group research as complementary methods that have different strengths and weaknesses and that are appropriate for answering different kinds of research questions. Single subject research is particularly good for testing the effectiveness of treatments on individuals when the focus is on strong, consistent, and biologically or socially important effects. It is especially useful when the behavior of particular individuals is of interest. Clinicians who work with only one individual at a time may find that it is their only option for doing systematic quantitative research. Group research is good for testing the effectiveness of treatments at the group level. Sorry, I needed a drink. Among the advantages of this approach is that it allows researchers to detect weak effects, which can be of interest for many reasons. Finding a weak treatment effect might lead to refinements of treatment that eventually produce a larger and more meaningful effect. Group research is also good for studying interactions between treatments and participant characteristics. Group research is also necessary to answer questions that cannot be addressed using the single subject approach, including questions about independent variables that cannot be manipulated, for example, number of siblings, extroversion, and culture. It is important to understand that single subject and group approaches represent different research traditions. This factor is probably the most important one affecting which approach a researcher uses. Researchers in experimental analysis of behavior and applied behavior analysis learn to conceptualize their research questions in ways that are amenable to the single subject approach. Researchers in most other areas of psychology learn to conceptualize their research questions in ways that are amenable to the group approach. There are many topics in psychology in which research from the two traditions have informed each other and been successfully integrated. And that is it. So there you go. I am in Maryland. I'm taking care of my son's cat. She's got diabetes. And I have to test her twice a day, and if she needs insulin, I have to give her insulin. So that's where I am right now. That's one of the reasons why I'm just a little bit behind, trying to catch up. Uh, but please forgive the fact that I'm kind of under the gun. I had to drive from Minneapolis to Lost Nation on what day was that? Monday, Sunday. And then I left for Maryland on Monday. Didn't I? Yeah, Monday. And I got here on Tuesday, and today's Thursday. So I drove for 2 days. I've been driving. I've driven about 4,000 miles in the last couple days. I'm a little tired. Okay, well, anyway, that's that. Talk to you later.